Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Stories for the week ending August 5, 2023. We begin with a story breaking on Friday, which is the chemical company Albemarle has reserved $219 million for an FCPA settlement. The company reported in a quarterly filing that it had agreed in principle to this amount with the Department of Justice and would enter into a non-prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice and an administrative resolution with the Securities and Exchange Commission, neither of which would require the imposition of a monitorship. So this has been a long-going case. It involved the company self-disclosing to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the Dutch public prosecutor. Interestingly, the Dutch public prosecutor declined to file charges in this matter. Next up, reported from the Financial Times, lawyers warn of massive test for the attorney-client privilege. This, of course, is the Covington and Burlington case where the SEC demanded release of information of their clients whose data had been compromised in an attack on Covington to see if those companies had disclosed this. Covington resisted this and was ordered to by a court. So this is going to be a very interesting case that we'll all follow. Next up from the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Journal, Dylan Tokar reporting that the SEC has told some Wall Street brokers to clean up their anti-money laundering controls and must do more to ensure their services are not being used to launder dirty money. The SEC examination units issued a risk alert saying it had observed broker-dealers who weren't putting enough resources or staffing into their AML programs. The unit also found that some firms were inconsistent with their implementation of policies and procedures. Although no firms were named, this is certainly a shot across the bow. Next up from the Washington Post, California's privacy regulator's first case will be probing internet-connected cars. This is becoming more and more ubiquitous as cars are now not only have internet access but are connected. Query, are these car manufacturers, Tesla, Ford, GM, etc., following California's data privacy laws? It's going to be interesting to see what these car manufacturers are doing in terms of data privacy and data protection, or are they simply selling this data on in violation of the FCPA? We will certainly follow this story and let you know. Next up, the second of three stories from the Financial Times this week, i.e., if you don't subscribe or read the FT, you really should. Work has dried up for U.S. consultancies in China after national security raids. Top U.S. consultancies are struggling to attract business in China as Beijing's national security raids are scaring away both local clients and global investors. Global investors, of course, are pulling back from deal-making in the country given the unknown political situation, and the consultancies Bain, BCG, that's the Boston Consulting Group, and McKinsey have pushed back the start dates for their new recruits as far back as 2025. I don't know about you, but I would think long and hard as an American about moving to a consultancy firm in Beijing or anywhere else in China, given the current political competitions between the U.S. and China. Next up from Reuters, Northwestern, mired in a huge scandal involving their football team and athletic department, has retained former Attorney General Loretta Lynch to conduct an independent review as the law school faces mounting lawsuits claiming harassment and hazing. Her firm will review the accountability mechanisms governing Northwestern's athletic program. Northwestern is facing at least 8 lawsuits from former players who say they were forced to take part in degrading rituals while on the team. Obviously, hiring someone of Loretta Lynch's stature and integrity is a big first step. Next up, also from Reuters, the co-founder of Altice has denied wrongdoing in the corruption scandal surrounding his company. He was arrested and detained in Portugal in late July, and a subsequent article said that Altice's France, an executive director of that company, had been put on administrative leave due to allegations against that person. So Portugal leading a corruption investigation, particularly an international one, is certainly welcome news for the international anti-corruption community, and we will follow this story. The next is the third of our articles from the FT this week, and it reports that audit firms are fighting to block expansion of fraud detection roles. The Big Four, the world's largest accounting firms, are fighting to block new rules in the U.S. which would force them to take more responsibility for rooting out fraud at companies they audit. Of course, you could immediately see there's a very big self-interest in this, because if they are formally charged with this task, they'll actually have to do it instead of claiming, well, we don't look for fraud. But with days to go before the end of the consultation period on the proposal from the PCAOB, these audit firms are trying to get clients to sign up, saying that fees will soar, and while the new rules would widen auditors' responsibilities, it will also widen their liability. So big accounting firms are not in favor of this. Obviously, it's a liability issue, and the fees charged, well, if they can get clients to claim it's going to cost more, I suppose they would charge more because of their greater potential liability. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Binance's founder, the fellow who goes by CZ, is drawing scrutiny from the German regulator BaFin, of course, well known from their terrible work in the Wirecard scandal. But the BaFin has advised Binance to withdraw its license application over the concerns about CZ, the founder, and the crypto company's complicated structure. BaFin believes Binance founder and ultimate owner would not pass a, quote, fit and proper test, end quote, which looks at whether people are professionally and reputationally or reputably apt to run a business in that they oversee or supervise. I think it's a fair statement to say all of these questions are certainly open when it comes to CZ and the way Binance is run, particularly with its very unique corporate structure. And finally, from the Washington Post, China is having a big military shakeup, and the interesting thing is this a military shakeup based on military reasons, or is it a military shakeup based on corruption? China has learned lots of lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and one of them is if you have a corrupt military, the troops on the ground are not going to be properly armed, properly sourced, or even properly trained. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. As I mentioned in a prior episode, this is the one request I've received most often from podcast listeners of the Daily Compliance News to put together a summary at week's end so that every compliance professional can catch up on the news quite quickly. So I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review to this new podcast addition to the Compliance Podcast Network family, 10 for 10. If you've got an idea for a podcast, I'd love to hear from you. I start many shows based upon ideas from listeners. So give me a shout. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. 10 for 10 is a proud member of the Compliance Podcast Network.